Senior President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. A pleasure to have you all here today. First, allow me to acknowledge that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and that of the programs we support takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are truly grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we must also recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. And what we actually need to do is to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. So thank you all for taking the time to join us for this critical and urgent conversation about how governments, organizations, individuals in Canada can support Afghan women through the current crisis they're living under. It is an honor to be here with our special guests, particularly the Honorable Ratna Omidvar, and who's an amazing group of panelists who will bring a wealth of perspectives and experiences to the conversation we're having today. For those of you who don't know the Canadian Women's Foundation, we are a national leader in the movement for gender equality in Canada. Through funding, research, advocacy, and knowledge sharing, we work to achieve systemic change. We support women, girls, and gender diverse people to move out of violence, out of poverty, and into confidence and leadership. Since 1991, 30 years ago this year, our generous donors and supporters have contributed more than $150 million to fund over 2,500 life-transforming programs throughout Canada. Through our work, we are able to focus on advancing gender justice in Canada. But our mission is tightly intertwined with feminist movements around the world. We know that reversals of hard-earned human rights don't just happen in faraway places. We saw that particularly during the pandemic. They can actually happen anywhere. And we can't just ignore these injustices or acquiesce our rights. As gender justice seeking individuals and organizations, all of us have a stake in tirelessly pressing for progress and taking a stand in whatever ways we can. We can actually make a difference by lifting each other up and showing our solidarity with feminist movements in Canada and beyond. For us at the Foundation, this means pressing for government policies and funding that support safe passage out of Afghanistan, doing what we can to support the courageous gender justice advocates who remain there, and amplifying stories of Afghan women's resistance. The Foundation prioritizes funding to programs serving communities and regions where there are multiple intersecting barriers. So this means working with organizations that serve women and gender diverse people who are refugees and newcomers to Canada. So we will continue calling on the federal government to invest more in the community-based gender justice organizations and programs that can support Afghan refugees and the resettlement process. I know that our panelists will share much more expertise on specific policy directions that we need to see. As these newcomers begin to settle in Canada, we will be looking to the grassroots organizations we work with for cues on how best to support them, remove barriers, and help to empower Afghan women. The path forward means that we have to take the lead from those who, with lived experience, and those on the front lines of change. So now, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Senator Omidvar for some opening remarks. Following that, we'll get into our discussion. There will be a short audience Q&A period at the end. You're welcome to post questions at any time during the discussion in the Q&A box. And now, please join me in welcoming Senator Omidvar.
Thank you, Paulette. Good morning and bonjour to everyone on this important call. Let me start by thanking the Canadian Women's Foundation for convening this important and very timely discussion. I also want to congratulate the Canadian Women's Foundation, and I have worked around them ever since they were founded, for its amazing work on violence against women. and in particular, the development of the hand signal that can be used by girls and women who are unsafe to alert passers-by. This is an absolutely terrific initiative that must go global. So on to Afghanistan. I don't think I need to tell the audience or retell the audience of the horror that has taken place in Afghanistan since July. And as always, there is a gendered lens to it, with women bearing an inordinate cost to themselves, to their persons, and to their safety. And I'm sure you read reports from Afghanistan about the rounding up of girls over 15 and widows under 45 so that the Taliban could claim them as their brides. This is abhorrent, it is violent, it is a crime against humanity. It is in trying to understand the reality on the ground in Afghanistan, I think it is important to understand that the Afghanistan of today is not the Afghanistan of 20 years ago, and therefore the women and girls of today are not the same as those of 20 years ago. In these 20 years, the women and girls have gone to school, they've gone to universities, they've become doctors, lawyers, journalists, they have played soccer and volleyball, they have become musicians and artists. Many have worked alongside the Canadian government and Canadian NGOs, and for this, they are being punished. And I believe we have a moral obligation, a moral imperative to protect them. And some have mused that, in fact, just as Afghanistan has changed in the last 20 years, that the Taliban may also not be the Taliban of 20 years ago. It may have moderated itself. I am not so optimistic. I see very little evidence to date that the Taliban has veered from its original tenets. It has said that it will rule Afghanistan as per Sharia law, even though Sharia law, in fact, is already the law of the land. It comes down to their interpretation of it. And the signs so far are not encouraging. The Guardian reported this week on the first known murder of a women's rights activist by the Taliban, 29-year-old Mariam Safi, who was an economics lecturer. On the streets of Kabul, advertisements depicting the faces of women are sprayed or painted over. Access to education for girls is somewhat questionable. In July, working women were told by the Taliban to stay at home, and they were told that the male members of their families could occupy their jobs. In short, I believe that we should be afraid, very afraid for our sisters in Afghanistan. So the question before us is, what can we do? And I speak for all women who are watching this unfold with horror. And I want to leave aside for a minute what global powers must do, including, of course, the funding for the World Food Program, because hunger and famine are becoming a big issue, negotiating with the Taliban to secure some measure of safety for women, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to focus on what we can do. It is important to have conversations about how we can help women in Afghanistan and help women who have fled. So I believe evacuation must be our first priority, evacuation of women in danger. And as always, when government lets us down, as our government has let us down this time, ordinary people step up. There are journalists in Canada, there are former members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are working night and day to get people to safety. And there are Canadian NGOs with an ever-growing list of women at risk. And we know that this work is tenuous and dangerous. And even whilst we wish them all success, further interim measures must be taken, such as ensuring that the remaining NGOs who are still in Afghanistan are able to reach women in danger, preferably with female intermediaries. And of course, we must hold our government's feet to the ground on this shabby mess up, as I call it. So for a minute, I want to turn our eyes on those women and girls who have managed to flee Afghanistan, who are in less precarious, but still precarious situations in Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Qatar, Albania, etc. The best and fastest way to help a small number of them, and I'll say small, is to get them to Canada. Canada has promised to take 20,000 refugees under a special measure program and a further 20,000 focusing on vulnerable populations. There are concrete lessons from our experience with Syrian refugees that we must apply to the situation. And the success of the Syrian refugee arrivals in Canada was due to many factors, but I put two to you. Two were critical. First, there was a hard deadline. I forget what the deadline was because it moved, but the promise was that we will bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees by the end of December or January. And second, Canada put a sacred cow out to pasture by providing all Syrians outside Syria with prima facie refugee status without relying on UNHCR certification. This means that the long and arduous process of proving your identity was put aside, and selection and confirmation focused on health and security status. So Canada should follow this protocol again. We also know that there are already Afghan women and girls in Canada, temporarily sheltered in hotels in Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. Of the 3,700 who have arrived, roughly 50% are women and girls. And here's what I know about them. Those who have worked alongside our forces or Canadian NGOs are in better shape. They speak English, they have connections to NGOs, to veterans, and this social capital will serve them well. But other members of their family are likely not to speak English. Household sizes are large by Canadian standards, 7, but not as large as some of the households of the Syrian families. Finding housing is the first challenge. They are not able to come up with the first and last month's rent, and it is hard to find homes for families of this size, particularly in large metropolitan areas. Most have arrived in Toronto and want to stay in Toronto, with others being dispersed to Vancouver and Calgary and other smaller jurisdictions around the country. There are those in the arrivals, colleagues, who are female judges, female parliamentarians, journalists, lawyers, artists who need to be connected to their counterparts in our communities. They're anxious to help in the resettlement process and need to find the connections to do so. This needs to be institutionally facilitated and not left up to chance. I hope that the Canadian Women's Foundation, along with Lifeline Afghanistan, which we have co-created out of the lessons of Lifeline Syria, will take this challenge up. These are big problems to resolve and solve. There are no easy answers, colleagues, but there is one answer that I hope will come out of this conference. And that answer is that our sisterhood with women from Afghanistan can be a powerful tool for joint and collective action. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you ever so much, Senator Omidvar, for being here. Thank you for grounding the conversation in a number of things in terms of the lessons from the past, but also the reality of what's happening on the ground and the urgency that we need to be acting with and pushing the government to do. And but also the hope of what can happen if we're able to implement these lessons that we learned from the past to be able to ensure that our sisters from Afghanistan can actually arrive safely, as well as be able to have the security of housing as they settle. So thank you so much for taking the time. We know you can't stay for the rest of this because you have important work to do right now, but thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. And we're going to now get a little bit more into these issues with our guests. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists who will bring the global, national, and provincial perspectives to the discussion following up from the Senator's comments. I'd like to now welcome Mariam Safi, who's a founding executive director of the Organization for Policy, Research, and Development Studies, also known as Drops, which is an organization based in Afghanistan. Welcome, Mariam. Debbie Douglas, who is the executive director at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Welcome, Debbie. Zainab Jamal, who is the Projects Associate at the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, CCMW. And finally, but not least, is Victoria Jacesh, who is the Project Manager and Executive Director at the Afghan Women's Center of Montreal. Thank you all so much for being here. And first, we're going to go to each of you individually so that you can talk about your organization's role in dealing with the crisis and key issues you're seeing. And then we'll get a bit more into specific questions for each of you so that we can delve into barriers as well as solutions. So let's start with you, Mariam, and please share with us your insights on the international front. And we look forward to learning more about that. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Paulette. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Canadian Women's Foundation and the World Refugee and Migration Council for organizing this really very important event at this very critical juncture. I think there's a lot of questions and we may not have the answers to all of those questions, but such discussions are really key to finding our way through what is an extremely difficult and heartbreaking time for Afghans within Afghanistan, those outside, and its international partners, and that being, of course, Canada as well. These opportunities for open dialogue are essential to ensure that the discussions continue and that the policy decisions are informed by consideration of a broad range of views, in particular those of Afghan women and civil society leaders. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the depth and range of conversations that have been taking place in New York, Geneva, and Brussels on the humanitarian response, future of human rights, women's rights, rule of law, and the security situation in the country. Most recently, UN Women brought together a delegation of Afghan women from various sectors for close engagement with member states over the Women, Peace and Security High-Level Week. This act of putting the expertise of Afghan women at the center of the UN's work, or that of the international community, whether it be in Geneva or even in NATO and Brussels, must continue, and their recommendations must remain at the forefront of their work on Afghanistan. I would like to reiterate a point that I often stress in discussions, and that is that we must never forget that the health of a nation is determined by the status of its women. Therefore, in my talking points today, as I describe the humanitarian response and the political engagements taken by the international community with the de facto authorities in Kabul, we must be cognizant that neither deprioritizes human rights or women's rights in the pursuit of stabilization. It has been the opposite of this act that has brought us to this point where we are now. The takeover of Afghanistan on August 15 by the Taliban resulted in severe economic instability and a climate of heightened uncertainty. The country is experiencing fragility and faces challenges on multiple fronts, such as poverty, food insecurity, climate disruption, displacement, and impacts on the economy. Over 90% of the population is estimated to potentially fall under the poverty line within this year. Core government functions and the provision of essential services have completely collapsed, with the exception of some assistance that is being provided to maintain access to health services. On the economic front, there has been a severe disruption in the financial and banking services, and that includes the services that are required by civil society organizations to continue with their work, as funding can't get to them. As humanitarian needs mount, it is imperative to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe and the socioeconomic collapse of the country, which would result in increased instability, severe security threats, and migratory flows in Afghanistan and the region and beyond. Aware of this acute, dire crisis in Afghanistan, perceived to be the worst ever faced by the humanitarian community in its recent history, the UN and humanitarian organizations have come together to coordinate its first large-scale attempts to operationalize the humanitarian response. The UN has established a special trust fund for Afghanistan. The fund is supposed to serve as an interagency mechanism to enable donors to channel their resources and coordinate their support for a strategy they are calling ABADI, Area-Based Approach for Development Emergency Initiative Strategy. And in Dari, ABADI means development. This approach is dubbed Humanitarian Plus, because conceptually it provides an articulation of investments in basic services, livelihoods, and community resilience that is intended to complement humanitarian efforts by helping households, communities, and the private sector cope with the adverse effects of the crisis. This is with an intent, and that's where the plus comes. This is with an intent to lay the foundation for future development support, because a key recommendation of civil society, Afghan civil society actors, has been to not allow the humanitarian response to overshadow any assistance that can go for the continued development of Afghanistan, in particular, the development or the mobilization and strengthening of its civil society sector, which is the largest achievement. It's one of the largest achievements of the last 2 decades. Now, the key questions facing the international community in its humanitarian response are: how will they ensure humanitarian aid is received by all, especially women, when it's difficult to have female recruits to deliver aid to women in a country where only women can access half of its population? If women are recruited, how will their security be ensured? Afghan civil societies are calling for benchmarks, such as respect for human rights, women's rights, inclusive government for the humanitarian aid community. Some agencies say this goes against humanitarian principles, while others say it should be done. How do we find the balance? Benchmarks would add additional pressures upon the Taliban. On the other hand, the country is facing a catastrophic crisis. So where do we bring that balance in these two approaches? Third, if benchmarks are set, how will the international community monitor their implementation? The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission is no longer active in the country. And there is no other international mechanism right now, except for the human rights repertoire at the United Nations, that has no feet on the ground and is dependent on UN agencies to give it its information. Fourth, how do we ensure sanctions on the Taliban remain an effective tool without depriving Afghan citizens of their fundamental human rights and access to humanitarian aid? Now, this last question is going to help me pivot to the discussion on sanctions. Afghanistan is legally obligated to uphold women's and girls' human rights, and it cannot be granted exemptions to operate in a manner that violates international law and lowers the bar for the legal protection of women and girls. There are some state members and working groups who have been working in the United Nations Security Council to address these demands. However, as we saw during our week in New York, that not all members are on the same page. It is vital for the international community to come onto a shared platform if sanctions are to be impactful at all. Today, in Afghanistan, at least 17 of the 33 of the first picks in the Taliban interim cabinet are designated under the 1988 sanctions regime. The challenges of ensuring sanctions remain an effective tool without depriving Afghan citizens of their fundamental human rights and access to humanitarian aid is an immediate imperative. And this becomes more complicated when sanctioned individuals are responsible for the governance of the population and access to humanitarian aid. This has some calling for the removal of sanctions for the sake of allowing humanitarian responses to be delivered to the public. However, Afghan civil society and women leaders have continued to underscore the importance of using sanctions as an important leverage upon the Taliban. But this can only be effective when conducted in compliance with international law that requires a united action by the international community. Additionally, the Credentials Committee at the UN will be meeting in December to discuss who would be the legitimate representative of Afghanistan to the UN. Many believe this decision may be deferred, as it is unlikely the committee will agree to put a group designated as a terrorist with sanctions into this seat. However, continued pressure must be placed even after December, if the Taliban do not meet the commitments and promises it had made upon taking over Kabul. Now, what are those commitments? One, the protection of lives in poverty, women and girls having access and returning to school and work and generally public life. Third, maintaining a general amnesty. And fourth, giving way to inclusive government. The first thing Afghans asked for after the fall of Kabul was for a peaceful transition of power that took into consideration the humanitarian conditions on the ground. Second, the establishment of an inclusive government that took into consideration the multifaceted aspects of Afghan society, a government that respected the rights of women, who are completely missing from the cabinet, youth, minorities, of which there's about 2, and other vulnerable groups in our society. Third, a government that is willing to discuss with its people the type of governance structure that should come about. You see, the Taliban want an emirate, while in the last 20 years, Afghans have experienced life under an Islamic republic with democratic structures. So it's important at this juncture that no one imposes one over the other, and the space is created to sit together and discuss a form of government that is suitable to both.
Thank you, Mariam. I'm a little concerned about the time, so I'd like to give some good time to our other guests. So I'll come back to you for the next round.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask, there's so much you said, Mariam, that I'd love to get into, but let's see how much time we have as we move forward, okay? So I'm gonna go to Debbie Douglas now to make her opening comments.
Thank you so much for setting the context, Mariam. It is so, I was so engaged with what it is that you were sharing. Good morning, and thank you to the Canadian Women's Foundation for putting on this event and for having me here. I work for an organization called OCASI, Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. The council is a policy advocacy and capacity building council that we are the umbrella organization for agencies that provide services to refugees, migrants, and immigrants across Ontario. Our work is grounded within an anti-racist feminist framework, and this is particularly so for us in the case of immigration laws, as well as settlement and integration policy programs and funding. The Afghan initiative currently underway should benefit, as you heard from the Senator, from the many lessons we learned 5 or so years ago during the Syrian resettlement. We were able to settle 25,000 Syrians within 100 days in 2015, 2016. And so I echo the Senator when she says that our government is failing us on this initiative. And there are many recommendations, thank God, that is coming forward from very many organizations, including Friends of Afghanistan, that she also referenced. We know that it is really difficult. It is a difficult journey to resettle in a new country. And this is particularly true for refugee women and their families. OCASI's advocacy priorities are intended to ease that journey for newcomers and for the many racialized migrant, immigrant, and refugee women and their families who continue to face many barriers to their establishment in their new home. Housing. I was so glad that the Senator referenced this as well. Housing is affordability, and adequacy is the biggest priority for us as a policy advocacy shop. Housing is a human right. It is basic. It is a basic essential need for everyone. But the lack of housing will significantly impact the resettlement trajectory for refugees, particularly for refugee women, and have long-term impacts on their economic and social well-being, their physical, mental, and emotional health. The housing crisis we confront is one of affordability, but also lack of safe and appropriate housing. On average, Afghan refugee families have about 5 to 7 members. The community agencies doing the resettlement work are struggling to find housing that can house large families, let alone housing that is affordable. This is not simply a problem for large urban centers like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, but a concern even in communities such as Kenora in Northern Ontario. This is quite significant in light of the fact that more than 85% of Ontario's population live in the lower third of the province, and the biggest concentration is in the Golden Horseshoe along the shores of Western Lake Ontario. We have a national housing strategy, long awaited and most welcome. The strategy is aimed at housing those in greatest need, what the strategy describes as vulnerable Canadians. The list includes folks who are racialized, recent refugees and immigrants. 1/3 of the housing strategy budget has been carved out for women's housing. The policy question then for us is, how do we make sure that the promise is fulfilled, that racialized refugees and immigrants will actually benefit from the more than $70 billion investment in the housing strategy? Immigrant and refugees are overrepresented among those in rental housing, but their experiences are not the ones shaping the national discourse on affordable housing and appropriate rental housing. The housing strategy is meant to be rolled out through collaborations between public, private, and nonprofit sectors. But we heard recently from our member agencies during a town hall that we held on Afghanistan and resettlement that they don't have the knowledge, the expertise, or resources to even stick a toe in these waters. And yet they are the ones, these are the agencies that have the knowledge and expertise in working with recent refugees and immigrants. And they absolutely need to be at this table and not to be shut out of this historical and critically important opportunity for people and the communities they serve. And while we welcome the National Housing Strategy, we also need to pay attention that we urgently need a reform of rental housing regulations to bring better protection for tenants, including issues like rent control, inspections for health and safety. We need to eliminate racism, immigration status and family status and size discrimination. We also need rent relief measures now as well as into the future. We know that simply increasing housing stocks, government simply giving land to developers will not bring affordable housing, which is what Afghan refugees and other refugees and women-headed households need. Housing affordability and poverty must be addressed together. We need to start by bringing the minimum wage at least up to the living wage and higher, so people have a way to build a resource base to build on their own home if they so choose. And I'll talk about this a bit later. The other issue that's of concern for us in terms of Afghan women is one of employment. I'm joining you from here in Ontario, in Toronto actually, and the Ontario government recently tabled Bill 27, an omnibus legislation that proposes to bring a number of employment and labor changes. Schedule 3 of the bill will prohibit regulated professions from including Canadian experience requirements as qualifications. Canadian experience has long served as a proxy for institutional and systemic xenophobia and discrimination based on a person's country of origin or for education and training. The Ontario Human Rights Commission, with the support of organizations like OCASI, issued a policy statement on this very issue in an attempt to remove this barrier back in 2013. So glad that 8 years later, the province is finally coming on board. Bill 27 will ban discrimination based on Canadian experience, but unfortunately only in regulated professions, not in the trades and not in unregulated jobs, which would be the majority of jobs in Ontario. The bill also provides exemptions, which is a loophole for regulators. We know that employment is the #1 preoccupation for recent refugees and immigrants, and housing, of course, is #2. Afghan women refugees are entering a situation where many jobs are lost or put on hold because of the pandemic. Statistics Canada has reported that racialized women, including refugee and immigrant women, were among the hardest hit in the labor market. Some may never regain lost ground. We need policy measures such as employment equity across all types of employment, particularly the private sector. We need to see a removal of the systemic barriers that still exist in the licensing process for regulated professions and trades, and financial support for low-income refugees and immigrants because the process of credential recognition can be lengthy and very expensive.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I know you have much more to say.
Very much more.
So I'm gently interrupting because I'd love to hear our other guests, also panelists, also share their comments, and then you'll have some time later on to get a bit more into that. So thank you so much.
Oh,
I'm now going to ask Zainab to share her opening remarks.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you to the Canadian Women's Organization for bringing us together on this very timely conversation. So my name is Zainab Jamal, and I work with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. The organization is dedicated to the empowerment, equality, and equity of all Muslim women in Canada. Our mission is to affirm the identities of Canadian Muslim women and promote their lived experiences through community engagement, public policy, and amplified awareness of the social injustices that Muslim women and girls face in Canada. And before I move on to discussing more of the what's happening on the ground here or abroad, I would like to share a bit about myself as well, because I think it helps us understand the current situation and how this is not new to many people. The generations before us have also experienced this refugee crisis. So I was born a refugee in Pakistan to parents that fled the country in 1980s during the Soviet occupation. And I was brought up and raised in Kabul and came to Canada in the late 2000s. We immigrated to Canada with my family. And what's happening is that the experiences of migration, displacement, forced displacement, and going to new places and creating homes, it's not new to many Afghans. They have been going through this for the last 40 years. So there's a lot of hurt and trauma in the community that must be taken into consideration when we talk about policies and we talk about programming. That this is a community that have generations experiencing refugee crisis again and again. And what also this shows is that the utter failure of the international community in preventing this happening again. For us to be here after 20 years is a failure on everyone's part. So putting that aside, what's happening here is that, eluding or, the Senator Ratna talked about earlier is that the Canada's response, whether it be evacuations or resettlement, has been poor, slow, and inadequate and not enough by any standards. We started our evacuations late and ended early. And at the moment, we've only brought in about 3,600 Afghans to Canada, and about 1,500 are in transit. Despite the fact that we've committed to bring in 40,000 Afghans to Canada. When they're here, I know for Toronto, they're being housed in hotels. And in the last 3 months, they've been asked to move 4 times in just 3 months. These are families with little children asked to stay and are told to stay put till the immigration IRCC processes their temporary immigration papers, and so that they can move out and start their lives. And that's they're unable to do so because there's clear lack of communication from government agencies in terms of timelines and when they should expect their applications to be processed. And on top of that, when constant moving around from one place to another creates a lot of uncertainty and anxiety amongst these families who have endured so much to get here. So there is something the Canadian government must do and act quickly is to eliminate the hurdles and loopholes that are in place right now, the stopping these Afghans who are qualified to be living here from being processed, and so that they can move on and enter their next stage in Canada. What's also happening is the evacuation efforts back home or abroad, it's also very slow. So we still have Afghans who assisted the Canadian mission in one way or another, still stuck in Afghanistan and unable to leave after 3 months. And we have Afghans who are bound to come here living in third countries, in safe houses, in Pakistan, in Ukraine, in Albania, waiting to have their papers processed as well. I know there's a family in Ukraine and their visa, their Ukrainian temporary visa is expired. They're afraid to leave their homes because it might violate their visa agreements. So they're stuck at home waiting to hear back from the government. And for some, they still haven't received their, they haven't received their case numbers yet. So the response from the Ghanaian government is slow on all fronts. And what's showing is that the very slow immigration processing system does not meet the urgency that the situation requires. We must step up. We must, come up with creative ways, with new solutions to address this problem. This is not, it's unprecedented, no doubt, but that means that, this requires creative and new solutions to, meet the demands. What I'm seeing as well is that the amount of love and eagerness to help that the local communities have shown towards refugees, and oftentimes they're the ones stepping up and doing the work in terms of fundraising or helping them with their necessary needs here in Canada. So any process, any policy implementations or decision making needs to take them into consideration as well. They need to be at the table. They're the ones working with the refugees and at a very intimate level. They know what they need and what they lack and where efforts should be directed us. And so I think what I'm taking in is, because the situation is unfolding on so many levels, is the collaboration from the local civil society, government agencies, settlement providers, to work together on meeting the demands and meeting the needs of this crisis that we have. Thank you. And then hopefully, we'll have more time to talk about other issues as well.
Absolutely, we will. Thank you so much, Zainab. And now I'm going to go to Victoria. And after Victoria speaks, then we have some time to get into more specific issues with each of you. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Paulette. I would like to thank the Canadian Women Foundation for organizing such a great event in solidarity with Afghan women. So my name is Victoria Jacesh. I'm the executive director of the Afghan Women Center in Montreal. I would like to maybe provide a couple of information in regards to the ties that we still have in Afghanistan, and also our operation here in Quebec province. When the news broke in August about the Taliban's takeover of power in Afghanistan, we again lived through years of fear and deceptions. We immediately raised concern for women's, girls, and targeted minorities in the country, and we needed to make sure they are safe. And we wanted powerful states to help them leave. Actually, there are two major factors that influence Afghan women or Afghan families to leave Afghanistan. There are push and pull factors. In regards to the push factors, now that the Afghan women have to function according to the Taliban Islamic law, first with the limited access to the education, and with the girls' secondary school now being closed. Their future is compromised. And second, in the middle of this humanitarian and economic crisis, where their services are most needed, women's aid workers are being banned from working. Most women groups feel intimidated and threatened, and women in general remain hidden in their homes, afraid to go out. Third, many women feel discouraged because they no longer have access to the jobs they once held, including jobs as policemen, university deans, publishers, businesswomen, politicians, activists, and so on. All are desperately trying to find their way out of the country. And finally, women protesters are regularly beaten up, and journalists are prohibited from recording any spontaneous protest. Fearing for their lives, they are forced either to flee or stay hidden, aware of the Taliban government's hostility toward them. In summary, in the face of continued oppressions and constant fearing for their lives, many Afghan women now feel compelled to escape their home country and are looking to Canada as a potential destination of immigration. So one of the major pull factors for Afghan women or Afghan families is Canada's willingness to welcome 40,000 refugees. Furthermore, Canada is known for its tolerance of diversity and its multicultural policies. Canada also presents opportunities no longer available to women under the Taliban, namely to continue to learn and to work And also Afghans who had worked for the Canadian government and who are now at risk for their collaboration are especially aware of the advantages that Canada can offer them and their families. However, for all such women leaving Afghanistan and immigrating to Canada is often a very difficult and painful process. This is the case because there are multiple barriers to integration in their new country, specifically in Quebec. It's a big challenge. So the first barrier is language. And Afghan women will be obliged to learn Canada's 2 official languages, English and French, specifically for those who would like to have a hope to get a job in Quebec that will bring financial independency. So they have to learn French also. However, the Quebec's Bill 21 is deeply discriminatory of Muslim women, given its prohibition of the wearing of a religious headdress in public service job. Afghan women also have to deal with systemic racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia, all of which create obstacles to their integration into Quebec society. So the Afghan Women's Center missions is to provide a wide range of essential services to the Afghan women refugees to help them overcome these barriers. Among these services are language courses in English and French and mental health support groups in which Afghan and other racialized immigrant women can share their presence and past experiences. Leaving Afghanistan cannot alone heal the trauma, fear, and anxiety induced by years of war and maltreatment. Cultural shock can be deeply disturbing and can prevent them from successfully completing the integration process. The sustained and reliable support, both practical and psychological, the Afghan woman provides goes far in helping them make a successful transition to the new culture. So immediately after the August crisis, Canada announced its willingness to welcome 20,000 refugees to its soil. After the recent federal election, the government announced its decision to double that number to 40,000 refugees. Since then, however, little has been heard from the government about its future plans to expedite this process. This lack of communication is disheartening, since many Afghans, both here and in Afghanistan, are anxiously waiting for Canada to announce how it plans to resettle the new immigrants. And in short, some general guidelines and greater transparency would greatly relieve this widespread anxiety. So at the Afghan Women's Center, we were surprised to learn that specific categories for eligibility were applied to potential Afghan refugees, which had not been the case during the Syrian crisis of 2016. Such categories, unfortunately, often exclude part of the population that are in grave danger. For example, policemen are not included and now have to hide from the Taliban's with the hope to escape. And furthermore, it seems that the IRCC embraced the sponsorship agreement holder as one of the efficient way to bringing Afghan to Canada. However, we believe this process to be discriminatory and worried that it will profoundly change the status of refugees. So therefore, we ask the Canadian government not to confuse what happened in Syria with what has been happening in Afghanistan right now. The political issues affecting these two countries are very different and therefore require different kinds of responses. So we're calling for the Canadian government and its allies to provide organizations like Afghan Women's Center with a clear plan of actions dealing with women's rights in Afghanistan and with facilitating the women's way out. One thing the Taliban desperately want is recognition as a legitimate source of power, and we are pressing Canada and its allies to use this as a lever for bargaining for the promotion of human rights. We believe that this will help influence the Taliban to do more to support Afghanistan vulnerable minorities groups. So I will have more to discuss. I'm going to wait for more questions if there are any for the second part.
Thank you so much, Victoria. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm reflecting on the richness of the information that you've each shared, and from Mariam's opening comments that I could listen to for about an hour, to Debbie's that is so complex and so important around issues around the housing and employment, the settlement issues that are important to consider, that both Victoria and Zainab talked about, as well as the xenophobia and other issues of discrimination that we need to do, and not to forget the government's response or lack of response. And so there's a lot that we can get into, but I'm going to ask each of you specific questions based on your work, and I'm going to start with Debbie. So Debbie, can you talk and share with us what you're seeing when it comes to sponsorship and its role in Canada's response?
Thank you, Paulette, and thank you, Victoria, for flagging the lack of communication, which is frustrating for everyone on the ground. Like 6-7 years ago, there are many Canadians, especially from the Afghan community, who have been waiting and ready to form Group of Fives to be able to privately sponsor folks who are outside of Afghanistan in refugee situations in many cases. Unfortunately, we don't have an official response from the government yet. We don't know out of the 40,000 how many will be designated as for private sponsorship. The sector needs to get ready. So we've been working on the assumption that 50% of the 40,000 will be privately sponsored. There is a number of things, policy questions here. We know that there is a significant backlog of almost 60,000 folks waiting to come in through the sponsorship agreement holders. In spite of that, we are asking the federal government, and Victoria, you and I are going to have a conversation about sponsorship agreement holders. We are asking the federal government to look at the whole issue of any Afghans coming in to be in addition to the cap that all of those sponsorship agreement holders have. I should say that the Afghan Women's Association of Ontario is a sponsorship agreement holder here in the province, and have been very much actively engaged over the decades in resettling Afghan people. There are a number of recommendations that's been going to government, so including with having Afghan privately sponsored on top of the caps that sponsorship agreements holders currently have. We are also asking the government to match interested community groups to the government-assisted refugees who have already arrived. We've been talking about the 3,700 people who have already arrived. There are 1,200 in transit coming directly to Canada. There are 5,000 who were airlifted to the US who are also waiting to come to Canada, to Calgary. We are asking the government for communities who are wanting to support, to be able to make that link between the private sponsors and our community organizations who are providing services to the government-assisted refugees. We're also wanting the government to ensure that if not 50%, a substantial amount of Afghan refugees that we're committing to settle are coming through the private sponsorship pathway. And that we're asking them to remove barriers. In 2015, when we were airlifting Syrians out, the government decided that those who are wanting to privately sponsor must be able to show that they have the money up front. Well, that presents barriers for many community organizations and community people, right? The regular folk on the ground who are bringing 4 or 5 people together to sponsor. There is no need for these people to be able to show X number of thousands of dollars up front. We know that they will undertake, and we know that folks, and I think the senator alluded to this, we know that folks who come through the private sponsorship program gain social capital. They come into a community, they're networked, they're able to be supported in housing and with finding employment and those kinds of things. Having folks put the money up front presents a barrier. So that's one of the things we're asking the government to remove. We're also having them consider private sponsorship as charitable donations. It's a new idea. And so if folks are putting money up front to support a family for a year, is it possible for them to be able to claim that back as a charitable tax receipt? Certainly something for us to continue to think through as we try to encourage Canadians to get engaged in bringing Afghans over here. We have seen that folks who worked with the Canadian military, the veterans have been very active. Folks who worked as journalists, the journalists organizations have been very active and have been successful over the last few weeks in airlifting out some of their journalist friends. We were very thrilled when the government created a new pathway of vulnerable communities outside of Afghanistan. So folks who are LGBTI, women, journalists, and those to be able to come to Canada. We are asking the government as well, not only for private sponsorship, but as government-assisted refugees to do away with the need to be designated as a refugee by UNHCR, by the country in which they're inhabited, and de facto make everyone outside of Afghanistan a refugee so that they're able to come into Canada, either as government-assisted refugees, but even more specifically as privately sponsored refugees. So lots of policy work to do, but I think the biggest concern for us is just the slowness of our government response, the absence of communication around where we are going and what kinds of supports are being put in place to ensure as many Afghans get into Canada as possible. We've heard the urgency of the matter.
Thank you for that comprehensive response, Debbie. I think there is so much complexity to what needs to happen, but unless we learn from the past in terms of what worked and what didn't, then we'll continue to actually put up barriers that are not required, that are not necessary. And as you were speaking, I saw a question come in that we can get to later in terms of how do folks advocate to be able to actually sponsor. So that's great. And we're going to have a question period. And so I just want you to sort of make your responses somewhat succinct so that we can get to some questions from those who have tuned in to be a part of this conversation. So now I'm going to go to Victoria. What kind of services and supports are most urgent for Afghan women, refugees on the ground in Canada, and how can governments and NGOs support their delivery? So I know you started to get into this earlier, but is there anything else that you would like to add to that particular point?
Yes, absolutely. Specifically to the Quebec province, housing, daycare, and schooling are important factors for Afghan refugees, and specifically for women refugees. So first, in considering the housing crisis happening now in major cities in Canada, finding reliable and good accommodation for Afghan families is essential for Afghan women refugees. So proximity is a small space accompanied by stress, anxiety, and fear could have an impact on Afghan women's mental health. Since Afghan women need the time and the mental space to focus on their own integration and resettlement, finding daycare for their children, as well as schooling for their older children, should also be amongst the top priorities. When arriving in Canada, refugees quickly realize they have to adapt swiftly in order to better integrate into society and start rebuilding their lives and careers. However, in order to do that, they have to confront first-hand cultural shock combined with harsh encounters with anti-Islamic racism. So, in particularly in Quebec, Afghan refugees and other refugees with Islam as their religion feel deeply rejected or excluded on a cultural and institutional level. The Bill 21 is a major indicator of institutionalized discrimination that Afghan women will have to face to their integration. And oftentimes, they arrive with trauma related to war experience and gender-based violence. The gap between this new normal at their past, as well as the lack of support coming from the community and government, can lead to isolation, preventing them from completing their integration process. So therefore, settlement into Canada and Quebec society can be deeply damaging, if not followed closely with psychosocial support and information session about the habits and custom of their new country. So Afghan women's mental health and reactions to their new lives should not be neglected. Governments should work conjointly with the NGOs and health organizations to offer these type of services and support. And adding to their stress, the marital struggle that may arise when women meet resistance when abandoning the old ways for the new with respect to dress code, age of their daughters, marriage, freedom to come and go as they please, become educated, work, or participate socially and politically. Furthermore, Afghan women refugees will have to learn a new language from scratch, French, indispensable for working in Quebec province specifically, and integrating into the host society without knowing its languages cuts refugees from social and economic opportunities such as job and friendship. Our organization aims to provide services and activities to respond to these needs. The Afghan Women's Center of Montreal mission consists in empowering socially isolated immigrant women of color within Montreal through creating of programs meeting their needs. And the AWCM facilitates self-development workshops and promotes team-based projects. Its goal is to provide opportunities for women and minority groups to improve their welfare through community engagement, and it was created by Afghan women and has been working closely with other Afghan women since 2002. So the Afghan Women's Center has been dispensing language and computer classes to Afghan women in order to give them the tool to navigate Montreal and Quebec autonomously. But fluency in language has to accompany it by a social dimension, bringing Afghan refugee women and Canadian women of all ages together is another way to break isolation and put into practice the skills that learned. If bringing Afghan refugees women into the Afghan community is essential, it should not keep them away from the host population. So that is what the Afghan Women's Center has been doing with this intergenerational exchange for years. And we encourage government and NGOs to follow suit.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thanks for sharing that. You paint a very vivid picture of all the different systems that need to come together to support their settlement. And so now I'd like to move to Mariam, who opened up our comments, this section of our program earlier, and talked about, gave us an insight into the role that the international community must play. So Mariam, what are some of the challenges and dilemmas you're seeing in the international humanitarian response? And what are the implications for Canada?
at the global front, speaking of the trust fund that has been created, which most of the member states have allocated their funding and support to, Canada is intending on increasing its humanitarian response as well. And some of the points that were reiterated by Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Bob Ray, were welcoming in our visit. Two of the key points that were reiterated there were, one, that Canada by no means would be recognizing the Taliban until there is evidence of them meeting their commitments, and those are the ones that I had articulated earlier. The humanitarian response will be there, of course, and continued support for women, peace, and security. He had made a mention of a point that that I think is very important, and he said that Canada is as strong as our networks in Afghanistan. And those are the civil society organizations, the women-based organizations that Canada has supported, in the last 2 decades. So in that two regards, I have two key recommendations. One, the trust fund that is there, it lacks a comprehensive and holistic and integrated gender approach. And so therefore we have to ensure that that we speak with one voice in ensuring that UNDP ensures that women are both part of the design and the delivery. Afghan women are part of the design and delivery of the humanitarian response in Afghanistan. And this can be done by having civil society and women leaders meaningfully and consistently consulted in the development and implementation of this response. The Trust Fund has a steering committee, and the steering committee itself should establish a mechanism that routinely shares and consults information with a broad range of women leaders and civil society and gender equality advocates. So it doesn't have that component right now. It also does not have a senior gender advisor to guide the overall work of the fund and integrate all the UN agencies that are going to be responding. And if you don't have that, then what happens is that then they've just got these indicators that they check mark each of the different agencies, and they submit that as proof that they're meeting these gender requirements. So we have to have that. And these are all grounds that the Canadian government, through its representative in the UN, can make sure that takes place. And in terms of the networks, there are, through the evacuation process, several thousand Afghans have left. That includes as women political leaders and civil society activists and human rights defenders. But let's make no mistake, there is a huge population of Afghan civil society members and women leaders that are currently there in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and in these different provinces. And so these women, in order to continue to support and strengthen these networks, they've got organizations that can do very, very vital work. And they're ready to do this work. And one of the things they're calling for is for flexibility and funding that Canada has long given through its Women, Peace and Security program in Afghanistan. But giving this funding through flexible means. See, it's not business as usual. The banking systems do not work in the same manner. But there are alternative ways in ensuring that funds go to these organizations so they can do the important work. Because on the one hand, while you have the humanitarian response, we have to continue to build the capacity and the empowerment programs and the various other initiatives, because like it was rightly said by Senator, that this is not the Afghanistan of 2001. We are a country, 2 decades ahead with significant progress that needs to be strengthened. Otherwise, we will see its reversal. And lastly, I just want to say that in the discussions that are taking place at the policy level in Canada, in terms of its support and in other discussions that are going to come up in the future, we have to make sure that we don't use Afghan women or Afghan civil society members sort of in an extractive process. It's not to go and extract that information from them and create your policies and whatnot. Make them part and parcel of that advisory and the implementation of those policies. Have them there with you on your side while you're making those decisions, you're creating those. And that I have yet to see take root. And lastly, as rightly said by the other expert panelists, Taliban want 2 things. they want economic aid, and they want recognition. Everyone asks me, what is our leverage? The international community predominantly asks, what is our leverage? Well, this is your leverage. This is Canada's leverage. And while Canada is currently meeting with the Taliban in Doha, meeting with the Taliban de facto authorities in Kabul, this is engagement only. So this is not recognition, but there's a fine line between engagement and recognition. So we have to make sure that we're not crisscrossing that where it suits interests. And I think that so far Canada has held that position quite strongly, though it's been quite weak on the evacuation. I want to share one small experience. When we were in Afghanistan in July, Canada started sending out text messages on WhatsApp and emails of those who were working with the Canadian, who had worked with the Canadian government to send their application processes in. First it was an email, then all of a sudden these text messages started circulating. I don't know what Canada had anticipated, but what happened was hundreds, I think about 200,000 individuals applied through this process. And then Canada didn't know how to process this. And this was only those who worked with the Canadians. See, my organization, I've engaged with the Canadian Embassy on multiple occasions, but my staff didn't qualify because we were not directly funded with the Canadian Embassy, nor did we work directly with a Canadian-based organization. But all of the other efforts that you had didn't qualify for that. And so what has happened is, though a lot of people applied, a lot of people remained, a lot of individuals that have been consistently interacting with the embassy were not evacuated. And so it left a lot of people sort of in no man's land. Right, and so this has been quite a poor process, but there are literally thousands of applications right now with the Canadian government that need to be processed. So we really need to make a move on that.
Thank you, Mariam. Now I'm running out of time quickly, and we do want to get to a couple of questions before we end our day at the top of the hour. So I'm going to just ask Zainab to share her comments with us. And so let me just make sure that I have the right question for you, Zainab. So most of the women coming to Canada from Afghanistan identify as Muslim, and you talked a lot about this issue earlier. What barriers do you anticipate they may face specific to their faith, and how can we help remove those barriers?
So the Afghan society, it's multi-ethnic, it's multi-religious, but majority practice Islam in different ways. You know, it's your interpretation of Islam, but they do identify as Muslim. And when they come here, one of the worrying concerns that our organization, and I believe most Muslims will have, particularly concerning to Muslim women, is the Islamophobia or the racism that they will be met with when they arrive here. We know Canada has a problem with Islamophobia, with xenophobia, with racism, and it's on the rise. We hear about news of like Muslim women being attacked, assaulted in Edmonton, in Toronto. The really horrific attack that took place in London. So it's a concern, and we also know that whenever some things go wrong in a country, usually immigrant population, the minorities are to be blamed. They're easy scapegoats. You point fingers at them, it's because of them that we have these issues. And now, so you have this, this community coming in, you have this population coming in, many will not know how to speak English, and they're learning how to settle. And on top of that, they have to face the problem that we have here in Canada. With Muslim women, and especially Afghan women, it's a topic that's used again and again in the last 20 years in different ways. It's politicized so much. Everyone has an opinion on how an Afghan woman should be, how she should dress. We all have biases about them, and a lot of times inherently, sometimes they can be very racist and colonial, so when we're bringing, when women or Afghan women are coming here, we need to let go of those biases. There's a process of learning and unlearning about this group of people, and that requires, from us to educate ourselves about them, about their culture, about their beliefs, about their customs and traditions, and make sure that we're not acting with them, we're not perceiving them how we have them in our minds. A lot of times, with the framework that needs to be used should be anti-oppressive and anti-racist when dealing with Afghan women. Oftentimes, sometimes we can get the savior complex of, we're saving them, we're liberating them, we're the ones that they're letting them live here, and it's all because of us. Afghan women should be centered in our conversations. The policies and the anything relating to them, anything that will affect them, we should have them at the table. Afghan women should have a say, and they should be equal participants in the policy formation concerning Afghan women. Also, with Afghan women, they're diverse. They have different needs, and that should be taken into consideration when we think about Afghan women. So we're not don't approach this as saving these people. They're brilliant women. They had jobs back home. Some of them can speak both languages and can speak English as well. Not all of them coming here will be having difficulty with English. They were entrepreneurs. They had businesses. And some were not, which is completely fine, because they're, it's a complex, they're new, they're not, we should not be generalizing them. It's not, your experience with one Afghan woman should not judge, should not control how you see the whole population. Each one is different, and each one will have their own different experiences. So when it comes to, again, Islamophobia, it's, our organization is deeply invested in anti-Islamophobia work. So we have workshops that, that organizations can take part, that can participate and take to better assist this community, because it's a concern, and it's something that we worry a lot, that they're prime targets in any group or any person that may be dissatisfied with what's happening with our efforts. They're the ones to be affected, quite literally the first ones to be faced with all these issues, on top of everything that they have to deal with, when coming to Canada or coming to a new country. So again, just reiterate that it should be anti-oppressive, anti-colonial, that we're not saving these women, we're not liberating them. They have agency. It's giving them opportunities to actualize their rights and their dreams. We should not patronize them. We should not tokenize their stories. They're not to make us feel better about ourselves and what we're doing. As a government, we're morally obligated to help them. Our government they were part of the coalition forces that went into Afghanistan, that were involved in the last 20 years. So coming here, it's not that, this is not coming out of some goodness that we, as Canadians are, but obligated to bring them here, obligated to help them and resettle them, but also should be done in such a way that respects their agency, that respects their values, that respects their lived experiences, and takes all that into consideration when we formulate policies, when we talk about them, that we're not using them as tokens, we're not adding them as diversity, as in conversations, because we need diversity, but the active participants in the policies and in the services that will be given to them, that they have a say in it, what they want and how they want it achieved. They're capable of doing that and deciding for themselves.
Well said. Well said. Lots of positive comments about that. Thank you so much, Zainab. And thank you all for shedding so much light on the complexities of this issue. It's deep and complex, and clearly it's not a one solution fixes everything. We need multiple comprehensive responses. And we could go on for another couple hours, I am sure, but I cannot. So I know that there are a couple of questions that Anuradha would like to get to, so I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Anuradha Dugal to lead the very short Q&A.
Thanks, Paulette. So I've been monitoring the Q&A that's going on. I'm, just for those of you who don't know, I'm Vice President of Community Initiatives at the Foundation. I'm based in Montreal or Chochake. So I am just here to highlight a couple of questions from the Q&A box and from the chat. Maybe very quickly, I will directly ask one person to answer each one, just in the interests of time, so that we can cover as many questions as possible. So maybe the first question is, if you're in a particular area of the country, like one particular person in our chat mentioned Calgary, how would you go about trying to find out how to sponsor a family or a person if that's something you want to do? And maybe I'll pass this to Debbie. As Debbie, you had this question, you quite thoroughly covered this in your remarks.
Sure, thanks Anu. There are a number of ways to become a private sponsor. As we talked about, Victoria and I mentioned sponsorship agreement holders who tend to be organizations that have been designated by the government to be able to sponsor folks from around the world. As we know, because of the pandemic, there is a significant backlog. Each sponsorship agreement holder is given a cap per year. Many faith communities are involved in privately sponsored, but also organizations, as I mentioned, like Afghan women here in Toronto. Individuals often approach these organizations. The issue around private sponsorship is that the folks must be outside of their country of origin. So folks must be outside of Afghanistan, and they must have a designation as a refugee, which is a problem we're having here. One of the things we were able to do with the Syrian initiative was to de facto make everyone who is Syrian outside of Syria a refugee. So they didn't need UNHCR to designate it, and they didn't need the country where they're located to designate it. The other way to be able to sponsor is through a group of 5. And what I just said about Canada needing to just say all Afghans are now eligible to come into Canada as government-assisted refugees or privately sponsored, because we know the situation in Afghanistan, regardless of where they are in the world. A group of 5 friends, family, workers, colleagues can get together. There's a threshold that you need to meet in terms of funds. And as private sponsors, you take on responsibility to support the family for up to a year. So that's certainly those are the 2 ways that you can go about sponsoring. And there are a number of organizations throughout the country who can give you more information.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Debbie. Very succinct and very clear. I'm going to jump to another question from the Q&A. How can we prioritize evacuation and settlement of women and put the pressure on our government to do so? And maybe this is a question that I will ask Mariam to make suggestions on how the Canadian government can be prioritized to move ahead faster on evacuation and settlement.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure if I am the right person to answer that question. I'm not familiar with the immigration process. So I think it'd be good if you pass that on to someone who had the expertise. Okay,
then maybe Mariam, the safety and security of women human rights defenders, is that one? That's one that's come up too in Afghanistan. Maybe while you're there, I'll ask you to answer that one, and then I'll return back to prioritizing evacuation and settlement.
You know, that question is really important. And that question is something that, I mean, we're all asking that very same question. The problem in being able to protect women human rights defenders in Afghanistan right now is that there's a very, very, very small presence of the international community. Civil society organizations are not allowed to yet operate. The Taliban are working on a standard operating procedure to explain which civil society organizations can operate and which cannot. So same thing with INGOs. So you don't have anyone on the ground to be able to do this. One of the recommendations that I have been giving to international stakeholders is to create creative solutions, development of applications, apps for telephones that can monitor and report human rights violations, for instance. And when it comes to human rights defenders, honestly, the only way you can protect them at this present moment, especially when their lives are at risk, and many of their lives are at risk, many of them went underground when August 15 happened, irrespective of the protests you see on the streets. So for these groups in particular, it's evacuation, it's getting them out of the country. That's the only way that you can protect them at the present moment. Now, in a few more months, as there is more and more clarity on all of these areas, we may be able to have civil society organizations operate through, I believe, only creative solutions. I don't think the Taliban is going to allow anyone to go on as it used to be. That's not going to happen, and they don't want that. So I think that as as a lot of civil society organizations left the country, are in resettlement, are currently in transition all over the world, haven't been settled as of yet. If you give them a few more months, I think all of this community, this diasporan community that now has emerged, they're going to come together, and I think that they're going to come up with very, very creative ways of being able to do that. But for right now, I would just say support organizations that are on the ground, create innovative approaches, use technology for that, and third, evacuate very prominent human rights defenders from the country.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to just 30 seconds for anyone who just wants to jump in and suggest ways that we can put pressure on the government to prioritize evacuation and settlement. A very quick answer from Debbie. Go ahead, Debbie.
There are two groups. Friends of Afghanistan have a letter that's going out later this week to the government with a number of recommendations, including evacuations, but also reaching some agreements with the neighboring countries in terms of getting people out of the country and then having them designated as refugees and being able to come to Canada, as well as some of you may know, Naomi Alboum and Karen Cole. Naomi is a former deputy minister, both federally and provincially, also have a number of recommendations going to the federal government in terms of making it easier for Canada and others to be able to support those who are needing to leave.
Great, thank you so much. I do see we've got 3 minutes to go, so I am going to hand it back to Paulette. Any of the other questions that are outstanding, we will try and answer in our follow-up email with you with the recording. So thank you so much for what you're able to share, and I'll pass it back to Paulette. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thank you so much to our incredible expert panelists. We are so fortunate to have had the time with you today. We do have to leave the discussion there. I know it's given us all a lot to think about. We'll continue tirelessly listening, learning, collaborating, and taking action in whatever ways we can to show our solidarity with our Afghan sisters. And in that spirit, I'll leave you with the words of one of our founding mothers, the late but great Rosemary Brown, who said, in the spirit of sisterhood, until all of us have made it, none of us have made it. So I encourage you all to think about that. Think about what you heard today from our panelists. Think of the work that's ahead. It's not an impossible situation, because even though the issue is so huge, it's not impossible. And what it will take is the collaboration of all of us working together. And I think we've seen that collaboration today with all that our panelists are doing from their respective organizations and spaces that they occupy and work in. So thank you so much all for being here. We appreciate you, and stay tuned for the recording that we'll also send out. Take care, everyone.